The threshold of power. The storm raged outside, beating against the windshield like a warning, but Judge Naomi Carter refused to be deterred. The Jefferson Grand Courthouse loomed ahead, its towering stone columns drenched in the fury of the heavens. She sat in her sleek black sedan, gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding like a drum of war. Tonight marked the beginning of something monumental, not just for her career, but for justice itself. She was here to claim her seat as the youngest and first black female chief judge in the city's history, a position she had fought for, bled for, sacrificed everything for. A faded photograph dangled from her rearview mirror. Her father, the late Marcus Carter, once a respected defense attorney, smiled back at her from a past long buried beneath corruption. The same courthouse that had tried to bury his legacy would now bear witness to hers. "I made it, Dad," Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible over the torrential rain. "And I'm here to finish what you started." With a deep breath, she grabbed her briefcase, straightened her blazer, and stepped into the storm. The courthouse lobby was eerily quiet as she entered. The scent of old wood, paper, and power filled the air. It was a place that had seen countless trials, ruined lives, and hushed scandals. Naomi walked with purpose toward the security checkpoint, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She had barely taken 3 steps when a voice cut through the silence. "Hold it right there." She turned to see a thick-necked security guard with graying hair barely glancing up from his crossword puzzle. His name tag read J. Grayson. He eyed her from head to toe, his lip curling in something between amusement and disdain. "Defendants wait outside," he said dismissively. Naomi tilted her head, her face remaining calm even as a wave of anger burned beneath her skin. "I'm Judge Naomi Carter. I'm expected." Grayson chuckled, a slow, patronizing sound. "Nice try. Judges don't come through this entrance, and they sure as hell don't look like." He stopped himself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. A second officer, a younger man named Pierce, moved toward her, his hand hovering near the holster on his hip. "You can wait outside," Grayson repeated. Naomi slowly reached into her blazer and pulled out her judicial credentials. She held them up, her gaze steady. "Look again." Pierce hesitated, but Grayson snatched the ID from her hand, inspecting it with narrowed eyes. His smirk faltered. His grip on the laminated card tightened before he shoved it back toward her. "New policy. All new personnel need clearance from upstairs," he muttered. "Step aside until we verify." Naomi didn't move. "That's not protocol, Officer Grayson. If you'd like, we can call Chief Justice Marlowe right now. I'm sure he'll love hearing how you tried to bar a federal judge from her own courthouse." The color drained from Grayson's face. His hand twitched on the desk, and for the first time, he looked unsure. A door swung open to the side, and a young court clerk rushed in, her eyes wide with horror. "Judge Carter, I'm so sorry. We've been expecting you. The Chief Justice is waiting in chambers." Silence fell over the lobby. Grayson and Pierce stiffened as realization dawned. Naomi took her ID back, straightening her blazer with slow, deliberate movements. Then, without another word, she walked past them, each step echoing in the stunned silence of the room. Behind her, hushed whispers began to spread. An hour later, Naomi sat in her chambers, her fingers resting lightly on the smooth wood of the judge's gavel. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished desk. She had waited years for this moment. And yet, the morning's encounter soured the taste of victory. A knock sounded at her door. "Come in." Valerie Reed, her newly appointed assistant, stepped inside. Young, sharp, and loyal, Valerie had been one of the few people Naomi trusted in this world. But today, she looked nervous. "The courthouse staff is assembled in courtroom 2B, Valerie said. "They're waiting for your introduction." Naomi rose from her chair, adjusting her robes. "Then let's not keep them waiting." Her voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations as Naomi entered. Rows of courthouse staff, clerks, Attorneys and officers sat in anticipation. At the bench sat Judge Robert Langston, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression unreadable. He had been a titan in this courthouse for decades. Langston stood as she approached. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth as polished glass. "Judge Carter, quite the entrance you made earlier." Naomi met his gaze, neither smiling nor shrinking beneath his scrutiny. She knew who Langston was, a man of influence, a man who held the old system in his iron grip. "Before we begin," Naomi said, addressing the room, "I have an announcement to make." Silence fell. Her gaze landed on 3 uniformed officers standing near the back. Grayson, Pierce, another man she didn't recognize. "Officers Grayson, Pierce, and Hall," she said firmly. "Step forward." The 3 men exchanged nervous glances but obeyed. "Effective immediately, you are dismissed from your positions." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Whispers spread like wildfire. Grayson's face turned beet red. "What?" "You heard me," Naomi said, her voice like iron wrapped in silk. "Racism and abuse of power will not be tolerated in this courthouse. Not while I'm here." Langston leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Now, Judge Carter," he began, but Naomi cut him off. "This isn't up for debate." The words rang through the courtroom like a hammer striking an anvil. The officers stood frozen, their badges gleaming in the morning light. Slowly, reluctantly, they turned and walked toward the doors, their movements stiff with rage. Naomi watched them go, her face unreadable. But as the doors swung shut behind them, she knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere in the courthouse, behind closed doors, unseen hands were already moving. Powerful men had just been challenged, and they would not take it lightly. The roots of corruption. The air in the Jefferson Grand Courthouse was different the next morning. There was a tension that clung to the marble walls like an unshakable presence, silent, unseen, but suffocating. Judge Naomi Carter sat behind her heavy oak desk, her hands pressed together, staring at the subpoena she had just signed. It was addressed to Chief Judge Robert Langston, a formal request for the financial records of all cases he had presided over in the last 10 years. Her firing of the security officers yesterday had sent shockwaves through the courthouse. But this was the real earthquake. "Are you sure you want to go this far, Judge Carter?" Valerie asked, her voice careful. Naomi glanced up, locking eyes with her assistant. "I didn't come here to play by their rules, Valerie. I came here to change them." Valerie hesitated. "I know, but Langston, he's not just another judge. He's the courthouse. He's been in this system for so long that half the legal community owes him favors." Naomi leaned back in her chair. "Then it's time to see how many of those favors were bought." She handed the subpoena to Valerie. "File it with the clerk's office. Make sure it doesn't disappear." Valerie took it with a tight nod and turned to leave. But before she could open the door, her phone buzzed. She checked the screen, and her expression darkened. "What is it?" Naomi asked. Valerie hesitated. Then, after a deep breath, she held up the screen. It was a news alert. Breaking. Judge Naomi Carter under scrutiny for alleged improper conduct in first day on bench. Naomi grabbed the phone and scanned the article. The words "judicial overreach" and "abusing power" jumped out at her. The piece was laced with subtle attacks, questioning whether she was too emotional for the bench, suggesting her firing of the security officers had been reckless and without due process. She clenched her jaw. Langston didn't waste time. "Leak this to the press," she said, tossing the phone back to Valerie. "Leak what?" Valerie frowned. Naomi pulled out a copy of the financial request she'd just signed. "If Langston wants to paint me as reckless, let's show the world why he's so desperate to get me out of here." Valerie nodded, then hesitated. "Be careful, Judge Carter. They play dirty." Naomi exhaled. "So do I." A silent war begins. By midday, the courthouse was buzzing. Naomi could feel the eyes on her as she walked through the halls. some filled with quiet admiration, others with disdain. She ignored them all, moving toward her courtroom. As she passed through the main corridor, a familiar voice called out from behind her, "Judge Carter." She turned to see District Attorney Samuel Price, one of Langston's closest allies. He was an older man, his face lined with years of experience and quiet corruption. He approached with his usual confident stride, flanked by two of his assistant prosecutors. Naomi waited, her face unreadable. "Quite the show you put on yesterday," Price said, his voice light, but edged with something sharp. "Ensuring justice shouldn't be a performance," Naomi responded evenly. Price smirked, tilting his head. "Come on, Judge Carter. We both know what this is. You're trying to make a statement, but this courthouse isn't the place for politics." "Politics?" Naomi raised a brow. "You mean holding people accountable for their abuse of power?" "Funny. I thought that was the job of a judge." Price sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Look, I'm just here to offer some friendly advice. Langston has been around a long time. He knows how to handle problems like this." Naomi stepped closer. "Then he should be worried. Because I'm not a problem, Mr. Price. I'm a reckoning." For the first time, Price's smirk wavered. He straightened his tie, then gave her a long, measuring look. "You should tread carefully, Judge Carter. Some fights aren't worth the cost." "Funny," Naomi said, stepping past him. "That's exactly what they told my father before they ruined his life." She didn't look back, uncovering the rot. Late that night, Naomi sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files. Every case Langston had ruled on in the past decade sat before her, marked with sticky notes and highlighters. She traced her fingers over the names of defendants. Young black men, single mothers, struggling families, people who had all been pushed through the system like cattle. The patterns were too clear to ignore. Sentences that were twice as long as similar cases, defense attorneys with suspiciously high case losses, plea deals that forced defendants into private prisons instead of county facilities. She picked up a file. Jamal Richardson, a 19-year-old sentenced to 12 years for possession of marijuana. She picked up another. Michael Sutton, 21, arrested for loitering. He got 5 years. But then she found another. Jacob Ellington, white, same drug charge as Jamal Richardson. Probation. Her hands trembled as she read through the details. Langston had sentenced black defendants significantly harsher than white ones for the same crimes. She slammed the folder shut, her pulse roaring in her ears. Her father had been right. The system wasn't just broken. It had been designed this way. She needed proof, more than just patterns. She needed a witness, and she knew exactly where to find one. The whistleblower. The next morning, Naomi and Valerie met in a small coffee shop downtown. The air smelled of burnt espresso, and the fluorescent lights flickered in the corner. Across from them sat Diane Fuller. Diane had once been one of Langston's court clerks before she disappeared 5 years ago. She was nervous, her fingers tapping the table, her eyes darting around like she expected someone to be watching. "I shouldn't be here," Diane whispered. Naomi leaned forward. "Diane, I know you used to process Langston's financial records. I need to know what you saw." Diane swallowed hard, then glanced at Valerie before speaking. "He had a system. He worked with certain public defenders, ones that never fought too hard, and prosecutors who knew when to throw a case. He pushed plea deals hard because he was getting kickbacks from the private prison companies. If a case had potential to be profitable, he made sure it went through." Naomi's pulse quickened. "Do you have proof?" Diane hesitated, then pulled out a flash drive. "I copied everything before I left. Bank transfers, emails, case notes. But if they find out I talked, I'm dead." Naomi took the drive. "No, Diane. If we do this right, he's the one who's finished. The threat arrives." That night, Naomi returned to her apartment, exhausted but determined. She set the flash drive on her desk and poured herself a glass of whiskey. As she lifted it to her lips, a sharp knock sounded at her door. Her breath hitched. She checked the peephole. No one was there. Slowly, she opened the door. A plain, unmarked envelope sat on the floor. Frowning, she picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a photograph of herself, taken earlier that day. Red ink had been slashed across her face, dripping down the image like blood. Below, in blocky, typed letters, a message read, "Sti open now, or next time, 8TWONTB8 woe earning." Naomi's grip on the paper tightened. They wanted her scared. They wanted her to back down. She placed the letter on her desk, took a slow sip of whiskey, and whispered, "Let them try." Shadows in the system. The photograph sat on Naomi Carter's desk, the red ink slashed across her face like a silent threat. The message beneath it, "Stop now, or next time, 8TWONTB8 earning," burned in her mind long after she had set the paper down. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling of her dimly lit apartment. Outside, the city hummed with life. Distant sirens, car horns, the muffled chatter of people who had no idea that the fight for justice had just turned into a war that was now personal. She wasn't naive. She knew power didn't go down without a fight. But this was more than just a scare tactic. This was a promise. A knock at her door made her jump. She grabbed the letter opener from her desk, a flimsy weapon, but better than nothing, before inching toward the door. She checked the peephole. It was Malik Carter. She exhaled, unlocking the door. Jesus, Malik. Ever heard of calling first? Malik stepped inside without answering. He was still in his work clothes, a button-down with the sleeves rolled up, his detective's badge clipped to his belt. But his face was tight with tension, his dark eyes scanning her apartment as if he expected someone to be lurking inside. "You okay?" he asked. Naomi motioned to the photograph on her desk. "Apparently, someone wants me to stop digging." Malik picked it up, his jaw tightening as he read the message. Then, with a slow exhale, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. It was another threat. "Judge Carter needs to understand that some lines shouldn't be crossed. If she doesn't, we'll cross them for her." Naomi's stomach twisted. "When did you get this?" she asked. "Found it taped to my car windshield when I left the precinct." They were both being watched. "Do you still have the flash drive Diane gave you?" Malik asked. Naomi nodded, walking to her desk and pulling it from the drawer. "It's all here. Financial records, emails, bank transfers, everything tying Langston to his backroom deals. We take this public, and his career is over." Malik studied the flash drive, his fingers tapping against his thigh. "You think it's that simple?" Naomi folded her arms. "It's not, but it's the truth." Malik sighed. "Truth doesn't always win, Naomi. It needs a plan." She clenched her jaw. "Then let's make one." Cracking the code. By midnight, Naomi and Malik were sitting in his cramped office downtown, the glow of a laptop screen illuminating their tired faces. Malik had plugged in the flash drive, and together, they combed through the files, their eyes scanning years' worth of transactions, case documents, and coded memos. "This right here," Malik said, pointing at a series of bank transfers, "is the key. Langston wasn't just taking bribes. He was laundering the money through shell companies tied to the private prison industry." Naomi leaned in. "And these case files. Every time Langston sentenced a black defendant to the maximum penalty, a deposit hit his offshore account within 24 hours. Malik whistled low. "Damn, this isn't just corruption. It's human trafficking through the legal system." They kept digging. The deeper they went, the worse it got. They found emails between Langston and District Attorney Samuel Price, discussing preferred sentencing outcomes. They found case notes from public defenders who had been bribed to steer their own clients into plea deals they didn't understand. And then Naomi found something that made her blood run cold. An old email thread. Langston to an unknown recipient. Subject: Carter. The daughter is becoming a problem. If she doesn't back off, use the file. Naomi's hands shook. Malik sat up straighter. What file? Naomi clicked into the email's attachment. A series of court documents popped up on the screen. It was her father's case. The case that had ruined his career. The case that had driven him to his grave. Naomi's stomach twisted as she scanned the files. It had been a setup. A manufactured scandal to discredit her father and drive him out of the courtroom. Langston had been behind it all along. Malik exhaled sharply. Naomi, your father, he was framed. The realization hit like a gut punch. For years, she had believed the story. That her father had taken bribes. That he had fallen victim to his own ambition. But none of it had been true. Her father had been murdered by a corrupt system. And now, they were trying to do the same thing to her. The counterattack. The next morning, Naomi walked into the courthouse like a storm in human form. Her head was high, her strides sharp and unshaken, even though every fiber of her being burned with anger. People stopped talking when she passed. Some of them had read the article about her so-called overreach. Others had probably seen the news about the ethics complaint that had just been filed against her. It didn't matter. She wasn't here to play defense. She was here to strike back. When she stepped into the courtroom, she found Langston already waiting at the bench. He was seated in his usual position of authority, his face the picture of calm control. He looked up as she entered, his lips curling into a slow, patronizing smile. Judge Carter, what a surprise. Naomi didn't smile back. She dropped a thick folder onto the bench between them. You want to tell me what this is? Langston arched a brow and flipped open the file. He barely reacted as he skimmed the pages. Financial records, wire transfers, the email about the Carter problem. Then, with an infuriatingly casual sigh, he closed the folder and met Naomi's gaze. You're playing a dangerous game, Judge Carter. Naomi didn't blink. So are you. And I don't play to lose. Langston chuckled. You think a few emails and some bank records are enough to bring me down. I own this courthouse, Naomi. I've been running this system longer than you've been breathing. What do you think happens when you try to take me on? Naomi stepped closer, lowering her voice. I think you're about to find out. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She didn't have all the pieces yet, but she had enough to make Langston sweat. And that was just the beginning. The trap is set. That night, Naomi made her move. She called in every favor, every contact, and sent an anonymous tip to Sarah Miles, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. By dawn, the headlines were everywhere. Breaking Eniodios. Jefferson Grand Courthouse under investigation for corruption. Langston's name was front and center. Naomi had just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. And now, all she had to do was watch the fire burn. House of Cards, the morning after the firestorm. The sun barely peeked over the skyline when the chaos hit. Naomi Carter had been in the courthouse for less than 20 minutes when her phone started buzzing uncontrollably. By the time she reached her office, she had over 50 missed calls and a dozen messages, all urgent. Then came the knock on her door. It wasn't just a knock. It was a pound, the kind that meant trouble. Come in, Naomi said, bracing herself. The door swung open, and Valerie strode in, her expression tight with controlled panic. You need to see this, she said, tossing a newspaper onto the desk. Naomi didn't need to read the headline. She had a feeling she already knew what it said. Still, she picked up the paper. Jefferson Grandi Curteos in Curisis. Investigative report at NCOVERS decades of CORUPTI. Chief Judge Langston, accused of accepting bribes, rigging sentences, and money laundering. Below the headline was a picture of Langston, caught mid-stride outside the courthouse, his normally composed face twisted in anger as reporters surrounded him. It was a spectacular fall from grace. Naomi flipped through the article, taking in the details. The journalist had used the leaked financial records, the whistleblower's testimony, and even old case files to paint a damning picture. And then there it was, her name. Judge Naomi Carter, a newcomer to the bench, was the first to challenge Langston publicly. Sources claim her push for judicial reform led to direct threats against her. Naomi exhaled, feeling the weight of it. This was it. The war wasn't coming. It was already here. Langston's furious, Valerie said. He called an emergency judicial meeting. Rumors are he's pushing for your suspension. Naomi wasn't surprised. Let him push, she said. I'm not stepping down. The courthouse is a battlefield. By noon, the courthouse was boiling. Inside courtroom halls, groups of clerks and attorneys whispered in corners, their conversations topping the moment Naomi walked past. Some gave her looks of admiration. Others, especially those loyal to Langston, glared at her as if she had personally set fire to the courthouse. She pushed open the heavy doors to the judicial chamber, where emergency meetings were held. A long oak table stretched across the room, where 10 judges sat, their faces grim, their hands folded. At the head of the table sat Langston. He was still in his immaculate suit, but today there was something different about him. His usual confidence had been replaced with rage barely concealed under a mask of civility. Judge Carter, Langston said smoothly. Have a seat. Naomi walked to the end of the table but didn't sit down. Langston's smile tightened. You've made quite the mess, haven't you? Justice tends to do that, Naomi replied. A murmur ran through the room. Langston leaned back, his fingers tapping against the table. You've put this entire courthouse under scrutiny. The media is already calling for trials to be reviewed, convictions overturned. Do you have any idea what you've done? Yes, Naomi said. I exposed corruption. Something you should have done years ago. Silence. Langston's jaw clenched. Then he placed a folder on the table and slid it toward her. Naomi didn't touch it. I thought you might want to read your own ethics violation complaint, Langston said, feigning sympathy. The committee will be reviewing your conduct next week. I'd recommend you resign before then. Naomi didn't blink. I'm not going anywhere. Langston's smile disappeared. For the first time, he looked worried. This is bigger than you, Naomi, he said, his voice lowering. You think you've won just because a few reporters picked up the story. You don't understand how this city works. I built this courthouse. I decide who stays and who goes. You had power, Langston, Naomi said. Now, you're just another crooked judge trying to cover his tracks. Langston's fingers curled into a fist. For a second, Naomi swore he was going to lunge at her. Instead, he let out a slow exhale and smoothed his tie. Good luck, Judge Carter, he said, his voice sharp as glass. You'll need it. The first attack. Naomi barely made it back to her office before her phone rang. She answered. Judge Carter, a voice whispered. She recognized it instantly. Diane Fuller. Diane, what's wrong? They know. Diane's voice trembled. Someone broke into my apartment last night. They took everything. My computer, my files, my notes. It's all gone. I'm scared, Judge Carter. I don't know what to do. Naomi's stomach dropped. Are you safe? She asked. I think so. But I don't know for how long. They left a message on my mirror. It was written in red marker. Silence, or else. Naomi's grip tightened on the phone. They won't silence you, Diane. I promise. She hung up and immediately called Malik. He picked up after the first ring. Yeah. We have a problem, Naomi said. Diane's apartment was hit. Someone's cleaning up loose ends. A pause. Then Malik's voice hardened. They're getting desperate. Naomi nodded to herself, which means we're close. The setup. The next morning, Naomi arrived at the courthouse to find police officers waiting for her. A pair of uniformed officers stood outside her office, their expressions blank and unreadable. Judge Carter, One of them said, "We need to speak with you." Naomi didn't move. "What's this about?" The officer hesitated, then pulled out an arrest warrant. For her. Her stomach dropped. "Judge Carter, you're under investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and obstruction of justice," the officer said. Gasps erupted around the hallway. "You've got to be kidding me," Naomi muttered. She knew this was Langston's play. He had manufactured false charges, just like he did to her father. "Come with us," the officer said. Naomi held her hands up. "I'm not resisting. But you better be damned sure you know who you're working for." The cuffs clicked around her wrists. A reporter who had been loitering nearby snapped a photo. Within minutes, the image of Judge Naomi Carter being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs was all over the news. The prison cell, the jail cell, was cold. Naomi sat on the hard bench, arms folded, waiting. The door creaked open. She looked up, and there he was, Langston. He walked in like he owned the place, his polished shoes clicking against the cement floor. He smirked. "I told you, Judge Carter. I decide who stays and who goes." Naomi stared at him, and then she smiled. Langston's smirk faltered. "You think I didn't see this coming?" Naomi said. Langston frowned. "What?" Naomi leaned forward, her smile widening. "Do you know what happens when you try to frame a federal judge for crimes they didn't commit?" Langston hesitated. Naomi reached into her pocket and pulled out a small recording device and pressed play. Langston's own voice filled the room. "Plant the evidence. Make it look real. I want her destroyed before I go down." Langston's face went white. Naomi tilted her head. "You just arrested the wrong judge, Langston. Now it's your turn." The fall of the puppet master. The calm before the storm. Langston stood frozen, his expression shifting from confidence to something far more dangerous. Fear. It was brief, barely there for a second. But Naomi saw it. She let the recording play just long enough for him to hear his own words again. "Plant the evidence. Make it look real. I want her destroyed before I go down." Then she pressed stop. Langston's jaw tightened. His hands, always steady, clenched at his sides. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said, his voice low and controlled. Naomi leaned back against the cold cement wall of her holding cell. "Oh, I know exactly what I've done," she said. "The real question is, do you?" Langston took a step closer. The air around him seemed to vibrate with barely concealed rage. "You think this little game of yours is going to work?" he sneered. "Do you think a single recording will be enough to bring me down?" Naomi smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Langston hesitated, because in that moment he realized something. Naomi wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. "I don't need just one recording, Langston," she said, tilting her head. "I have dozens." Langston stilled. Naomi crossed her arms, her smile growing wider. "Let me guess. You assumed I didn't have a backup plan? That I'd just walk into your little trap without making sure I had a way out?" She leaned forward. "Langston, I'm a judge. I know how this game works. I just play it better." For the first time in his career, Robert Langston didn't have a move to play. The power struggle. 30 minutes later, Naomi sat in the same holding cell, her mind racing through the next steps. Her phone call had already gone through. Malik and Valerie were working on two things: getting her out, taking Langston down, once and for all. The real question was, how much more damage would Langston do before that happened? As if to answer that thought, the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't Langston. It was District Attorney Samuel Price. Naomi's lips curled. "Oh, this just keeps getting better." Price walked in, smoothing his tie, his usual smug confidence radiating off him. "Judge Carter," he greeted, as if she weren't sitting in a jail cell he had likely helped put her in. Naomi didn't move, didn't give him the satisfaction of looking intimidated. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Price?" she asked coolly. Price exhaled. crossing his arms. "Look, I'll be honest with you. Langston wants you out. Permanently. And if you keep pushing, he's going to bury you." Naomi tilted her head. "Let me guess. This is the part where you offer me a deal." Price smiled. "You're smart. So, let's be smart about this. Step down. Leave the courthouse. You can spin it however you want. Say it's for personal reasons, or that the fight isn't worth it anymore. We'll make sure the charges against you disappear." Naomi stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. A sharp, unexpected laugh that made Price blink in confusion. "You think I'd just walk away?" she asked, shaking her head. "You really don't get it, do you?" She stood up, stepping closer to him. "I'm not like the others, Price. I don't take deals. I don't walk away. And I sure as hell don't run from men like you." For the first time, Price faltered. "You don't have a choice," he said, but it didn't sound convincing anymore. Naomi held his gaze. "I always have a choice. And I choose to fight." The walls began to crumble. By the time Naomi was released on bail, the courthouse was in chaos. Malik and Valerie were waiting outside as she stepped into the sunlight. Reporters were everywhere, cameras flashing, microphones being shoved in her face. "Judge Carter, do you have a statement about your arrest? Are the allegations true? Are you stepping down from the bench?" Naomi ignored them, walking straight to Malik and Valerie. Malik handed her a phone. "We have a problem." She glanced at the screen. "New illegid documentes mkpilitagvg in BRI CANDAL. Her stomach dropped. She scrolled through the article. The documents were fake, of course, doctored to look like she had taken bribes to rule in certain cases. Langston wasn't just trying to destroy her. He was trying to erase her. Naomi clenched her jaw. "They're going all in." Valerie nodded. "They're scared, which means we hit them where it hurts." Naomi exhaled. "Then let's hit harder." Flipping the board, Naomi knew Langston's biggest weakness: his allies. They had been loyal because he had been untouchable, because he had protected them. But now, he was a sinking ship, and Naomi was about to light the whole thing on fire. That night, she met with Malik and Valerie in a safe house. "We need to turn someone inside Langston's circle," Naomi said. "Someone who knows enough to take him down for good." Malik nodded. "I got a name. Ethan Calloway." Naomi's brow lifted. Calloway was a prosecutor under Price. If anyone had dirt on Langston's operations, it was him. But there was one problem. "He won't talk," Naomi said. Valerie smirked. "Not yet." Malik leaned forward, sliding a manila folder across the table. Naomi opened it. Inside were surveillance photos of Calloway meeting with private prison executives. "Turns out," Malik said, "he's been taking kickbacks too. But unlike Langston, he's not powerful enough to make this go away. If we offer him a deal, he'll flip." Naomi smiled. Now they had leverage. And once Calloway talked, Langston was finished. The endgame begins. The next morning, Naomi walked into the courthouse with new energy. She had spent months fighting from the shadows. But now she was about to step into the light. She pushed open the heavy doors to the courtroom, her heels clicking against the floor. And there he was, Langston, sitting at the defense table, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Naomi walked past him, but she didn't stop. She took her place at the bench. And for the first time, Langston realized the truth. Naomi wasn't just another judge. She was the reckoning he never saw coming. And this time, she wasn't leaving without burning his empire to the ground. The reckoning. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, the air thick with tension. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras flashing, microphones raised. The public gallery overflowed with legal scholars, activists, and community members, all waiting for justice to be served. At the defense table sat Robert Langston. He had aged 10 years overnight. The weight of the corruption scandal, financial fraud, judicial misconduct, and bribery charges hung over him like an executioner's blade. His once impeccable posture had stiffened, his usual arrogance replaced by a tight, forced composure. His high-powered legal team whispered furiously, shuffling through stacks of last-minute legal maneuvers. But Naomi Carter, she sat at the bench, calm, steady, unshaken. This was her moment. This was justice. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Naomi Carter presiding. The courtroom rose as Naomi took her seat. She had been framed, arrested, and dragged through the mud. She had lost allies, been threatened, and nearly destroyed. But now she held the gavel. And this time, she wasn't leaving until Langston's empire was nothing but ashes. The key witness. Prosecution, call your next witness. The lead federal prosecutor stood. The government calls Ethan Calloway. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Calloway, ***, Langston's former right-hand man, a top prosecutor, a loyal enforcer of the system, ***, was about to testify against his old boss. Naomi watched as Ethan Calloway walked in. He looked haunted. His hand shook slightly as he took the stand, his once pristine suit now wrinkled, his face pale. He was a man who had spent years helping Langston cover up corruption. Now he was here to end it. "Mr. Calloway," the prosecutor began, "how long did you work under Chief Judge Langston?" Calloway exhaled. 15 years. "And in those 15 years, were you aware of any misconduct by Judge Langston?" A pause. Then Calloway nodded. "Yes. His throat tightened. "I was part of it." A gasp spread through the room. Naomi remained still, watching. Calloway gripped the microphone. Judge Langston controlled everything. He fixed cases, manipulated evidence, and took bribes. We all knew. The defense attorneys, the prosecutors, even some judges. If you didn't follow orders, you lost your career. Did he ever ask you to fabricate evidence? Calloway swallowed hard. Yes. Can you explain? Calloway hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled out a small black notebook. The courtroom fell silent. "This is Langston's ledger," Calloway said, his voice shaking. "It contains every name, every bribe, every deal. It's all here." The evidence was undeniable. Langston's entire criminal enterprise, documented in his own handwriting. Naomi watched as Langston's face drained of color. For the first time, the powerful judge looked truly afraid. Langston's last move. The courtroom erupted. Langston's lawyers shouted objections. Reporters rushed to record the breaking news. The prosecution presented the ledger to the court, flipping through years of criminal activity, payments to defense attorneys, altered case files, offshore accounts, all of it leading back to one man. Langston tried to remain calm. But Naomi saw the subtle shift. He was calculating, planning. He wasn't done fighting. And then, it happened. One of his lawyers stood. "Your Honor, my client has a statement to make." Naomi nodded, watching as Robert Langston stood from the defense table. He smiled. And the moment she saw it, she knew. He had one last trick. "I would like to submit a motion to dismiss all charges against me," Langston said smoothly. The room froze. Naomi narrowed her eyes. On what grounds? Langston adjusted his tie. "Because Judge Naomi Carter is unfit to preside over this case." A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Langston's lawyer stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have proof that Judge Carter has engaged in unethical judicial behavior. She has personally interfered in this investigation. She has violated judicial conduct rules by pursuing a vendetta against my client." Naomi clenched her jaw. This was his plan. If he couldn't win, he would drag her down with him. "You have no evidence of misconduct," Naomi said coldly. Langston's smirk widened. "Oh, but we do." His lawyer pulled out a folder. Inside were emails. Doctored, edited, faked. Emails that made it look like Naomi had taken bribes to go after Langston. A calculated, precise attack. The room exploded with noise. Reporters typed furiously. Judges whispered amongst themselves. Naomi took a slow breath. Langston was playing his last card. And it was a hell of a move. But he had made one mistake. He underestimated her. The final move. Naomi stood. The courtroom fell into dead silence. She didn't look at the emails, didn't acknowledge the whispers. She locked eyes with Langston. "Your Honor," she said, turning to the senior oversight judge, "I move to allow full public release of the evidence against Langston. Every single file, case, and document. Unredacted." Langston's smirk vanished. His lawyers objected. Naomi cut them off. "Enough," she said. "The people have a right to know. Let's put it all out in the open. Every corrupt case, every bribe, every deal. Let's see if my emails hold up against your record, Langston." The oversight judge hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. Motion granted. Langston froze. Because he knew. The moment the public saw the full scope of what he had done, he was finished. The verdict. It took the jury less than an hour. They returned, their faces grim, cold, final. The foreperson stood. On all counts of judicial corruption, bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty. Langston slumped in his chair. The courtroom erupted. Naomi sat back, watching as federal agents approached Langston, pulling him to his feet. For the first time in decades, he was the one in handcuffs. "You think this changes anything?" He spat, his voice shaking. Naomi stood, adjusting her robe. "It already has." Langston's eyes burned with asterisk rage, fear, and something else. Asterisk, the realization that his kingdom had crumbled. As the doors closed behind him, Naomi turned back to the courtroom. To the people who had watched her fight. She lifted the gavel, brought it down hard. And just like that, the reign of corruption was over. The aftermath. Langston was sentenced to life in prison. Dozens of judges, lawyers, and officials resigned or were indicted. Hundreds of wrongful convictions were overturned. Naomi Carter became a national icon of judicial reform. But for Naomi, it wasn't about fame. It was about justice. And she wasn't done yet, because the fight for a fair system was just beginning.